China reinforces the importance of globalization and international cooperation. We'll take a look at the annual meeting of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was founded 5 years ago with a goal to promote development not only in the region but around the world. Today, it has more than 100 members and projects in many countries. The AIIB wrapped up its two-day 2020 meeting on Wednesday. It was a different gathering, though, a virtual one, due to the pandemic. And COVID-19 was on the agenda. The event looked at how the pandemic can be used as a unique opportunity to reassess regional connectivity. CGTN's Liang has more from Beijing.
One of the key topics discussed at the AIIB's 2020 annual meeting was how countries and businesses should adapt in a post-COVID-19 era. Members of the multilateral bank highlighted the need to close the digital divide between countries and to bring in more private investments, as the debt level of some countries is expected to rise as a result of increased fiscal expenditure.
Disruptions to trade, you see that even this crisis has in some ways and in some areas increased tendency toward protectionism. That is another form of disrupting connectivity. Those tendencies may have been there before, but especially in the areas of medical supplies, we have seen a tendency toward protectionism, and we really hope that that will subside and recede to be able to address the crisis when, for example, vaccines need to be shipped around the world.
Infrastructure spending is often seen as a counter-cyclical stimulus to boost the economy. In this regard, I asked the AIIB, how resilient is Asia's infrastructure sector, given reports of project delays caused by funding difficulties and supply chain disruptions? They say trust is key.
Infrastructure typically involves governments at different levels. When we talk about regional connectivity, we talk about coordinating the investments of different governments in different countries. So you need to have a framework where those who invest on one side of a border trust that there will be investments on the other side of the border and the road continues. And where this trust is not in place, multilateral partners like multilateral development banks can sometimes be the honest brokers that help facilitate those investments.
As countries emerge from a COVID-19 survival phase to a recovery phase, AIIB members say attention should be paid to a new form of connectivity infrastructure, one that is resilient and sustainable and satisfies the needs that are in line with commitments made to address climate change. Weilin Tang, CGTN, Beijing.
To discuss international investments in infrastructure, let's bring in our panel here in Washington, D.C. via Skype. Jeff Moon is president of China Moon Strategies. That's a consulting firm. From Maryland, Emira Woods is a founding board member of Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity. Liang is a professor of economics at Willamette University, joining us from Portland. And from Beijing, Einar Tangen is a current affairs commentator. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Einar, we're certainly getting used to a lot of these addresses at these gatherings via video link. President Xi delivering his. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The global response to the COVID-19 pandemic has made it clear that mankind rises and falls together in a community with a shared future. Mutual support and cooperation in solidarity are the only way for mankind to overcome crises. To address issues emerging in the course of economic globalization, countries should pursue more inclusive global governance, more effective multilateral institutions, and more robust regional cooperation.
So, Einar, you tease up our conversation. What do you make of his comments?
Well, it's the very steady, predictable plan that Xi Jinping is always pushing. It's always about connectivity, shared future, etc. But what's significant is that he went to the AIIB. Remember, this is the number 4 bank in the, multilateral bank in the world after World Bank, IMF, and ADB. Yet it seems to be responding in a very robust manner, considering its size, and expanding very quickly. At 102 countries, it is now beyond the halfway mark in terms of membership. So at this point, I think he's sending a very strong message that multilateral platforms are the way to go, a very strong contrast to what Donald Trump is saying.
Jeff, indeed, he's pushing for globalization, more cooperation, talking about multilateralism. But you heard in our report that, we've got this problem with protectionism. It's disrupting connectivity. Give us your sense of where things stand right now with international trade.
Well, I think international trade is in crisis, quite frankly. The rules-based WTO system experiences a crisis. We not only are looking for a new leader right now, but we also need a lot of reform. Part of the problem is here in Washington, where Trump has not supported multilateral trade organizations. But there's also this problem of what to do with the world's second largest economy, which is China, which received lots of benefits when it stepped back onto the world stage 30, 40 years ago and doesn't want to give up those benefits. There's an irony here that China is hosting 100 members of the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, which is promising billions of dollars. And then yet at the WTO, China claims that it's a developing country that needs the same kind of benefits that Sub-Saharan Africa needs. So we need a reset here. There's protectionism all around. We went through the trade war and the issues were not resolved. And so now those issues are moving forward in yet another forum.
Liang, I'd like to get your response to what Jeff just said.
I don't think it's inconsistent where China is still a developing country if you look at the GDP per capita. So I think it still enjoys the status as a developing nation, that it has a long way to increase the per capita GDP at the by the WTO standards as a developing nation. And yet at the same time, China is the second largest economy in terms of the total economic size. And so there has been all this claims that China needs to take on the global leadership and global sort of responsibility. And so that is exactly the place where China is trying to play a leadership role. China chipped in half of the funding capital of the AIIB and now holds 26% of the voting shares. And it really understands the developing countries' needs for infrastructure spending, where the developing world right now is facing an infrastructure funding gap of $2.5 trillion per year. So I think with this vision and with these kinds of responsibility, I think China is playing a very important role at the AIIB, but it's not contradictory with its own developmental stage.
Let's talk a little bit more about the bank, Liang, because I interviewed Parag Khanna last year, the author of The Future is Asian, and he said at the time that the bank was the fastest growing multilateral organization in history. I mean, that may be a bit of an overstatement, but there's no doubt that it really has gone from 0 to 60 in a short period of time. What's been the secret to that?
I think there are a couple, I would say at least 3 important features that made this bank quite successful at this point. For one is, like I said, it becomes a platform where developing countries' voices are heard and their needs are met, and international coordination is being emphasized. And so I think this makes the bank popular. It grew, like you talked about, from 57 founding members to now 103 actually member countries. And the second is, like I said, it focuses on infrastructure, and it's not just a physical infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure. And that is very important and fills a very important vacuum. And last but not the least, I think its own governance structure is very unique. It emphasizes being lean, being clean, and being green. And all of these, I think, are meeting the demands of a lot of developing countries in terms of their needs. So this organization has only 300 plus employees, in contrast with over 10,000 in the World Bank or 3,000 at the AIIB. So it cuts off a lot of the bureaucratic layers and streamlined the projects. And it also emphasizes on sustainability, hold high standards in terms of environmental, social, and governance responsibilities. So I think all of these contribute to its success and its increasing role in the developing world.
Einar, can I ask you a question about that? Because it's interesting. She just brought up, I thought, a really important point. I interviewed the president of the AIIB, Jin Lichun. That was back in 2016 in Hangzhou during the G20. And he told me at the time when he was taking this job, a lot of people told him, don't do it, it's going to tarnish your reputation. But that's one of the things he touted, was that there was going to be more money actually for the loans. He was not going to have this high overhead. He wasn't going to have a lot of employees and a lot of bureaucracy. Has that been one of the keys to the success, do you think?
Absolutely, Mike. You know, it's all about actions and how you judge them. You know, my colleague from Washington is touting what he says is an unfair situation. Well, what's unfair is that the United States, with 5 times the per capita income as the average person in China, is doing very, very little for the world. He seems to admit the fact that, you know, the U.S. has put, what, $273 million into entire Africa. This is the amount of COVID-19 relief. China has taken serious steps to relieve debt, also pledged $2 billion on top of the $50 million that it's put to the WHO. I think it's very clear China has been pushing the broader agenda while the U.S. has been retreating. So these snipes at you know, China is saying that it's somehow unfair. I think those should fall on deaf ears. This is not the situation.
Emira, this is a good chance for you to jump in, because the AIIB is not just about Asia. There are 10 African countries as part of the bank, and now 9 more prospective members. What's the role there on the continent?
Well, the role is quite frankly mixed, right? I think you have to recognize that the traditional places, the traditional international financial institutions, especially the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, have since the 1940s, even before many of the African countries became independent, you know, has a framework that is essentially $1, one vote in terms of its governance structure. And I think what you have is not only an imbalance in terms of who sets the agenda and what's on that agenda, but then you also have these neoliberal strings attached to the loans in terms of how spending can be made. You know, often it is deregulation of economies. It is, you know, reducing any form of capital controls. There are these set criteria before World Bank or International Monetary Fund monies are accessed. And so what you have is an alternative that's been set up. It's just 5 years. We've got to see how it all evolves. But it's an alternative that doesn't have those onerous strings, and also is really focused on infrastructure, which is a growing need not only for the African world, but for much of the much of the global South. And so I think the issue is, to what extent can these added funds be made available without also adding to the also onerous debt burden that many of these countries are already facing, have faced since the 1970s, because of the again, you know, the relationships with the traditional international financial institutions. So how do we not deepen the debt burden? I think that is a huge question that is still unanswered. And I think the other issue when we talk about lean, yes, quite frankly, 300 staff is quite lean, but we have to push on this question of green, because there have been real concerns raised about how green the loans will be and to what extent there can be a true push towards a Green New Deal for countries around the world that is financed through the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank.
One of the things, though, when you look at some of these other banks, they tend to focus on poverty or education. This focus on infrastructure is a saying that the Chinese like to say, if you want to build wealth, build roads. I interviewed Jude Moore, who was the head of Minister of Public Works for a time in the Liberian government, and he was telling me that there are 9 transcontinental highways in Africa that have not been completed, and he said infrastructure is key. So just how vital will it be for the African continent?
Well, Liberia is a country where I'm from, so I know it well. With you know, decades of a civil crisis throughout the country, you know, the infrastructure needs are vast, right? So those needs are replicated in countries around the global South. It is the as particularly now the digital infrastructure, but it's also the brick and mortar infrastructure, roads, railways, you know, transportation that will help to bring goods to particularly to local markets and and will also bring regional trade across the continent that is now a continent committed to a free trade zone. So it is a new era, in terms of infrastructure needs. And I think it is critical to look at partners, including partners in the Asian world, to actually accompany the priorities set by African countries, but also by the African Union in advancing its goals for the next until 2063 and beyond, right? So it is these goals that have been well framed, but it is also recognizing that we're in this now COVID era where the needs are even more vast for health infrastructure, for communication infrastructure to actually save lives. So I think the needs are vast. And I think the concern is, how do you begin to engage now, with a new financial institution without adding to a debt burden, which means we've got to look at other financing mechanisms beyond loans that are going to actually invest in the future, invest in a way that helps to spur domestic resource mobilization, that helps to spur domestic development. And I think that is what will be most viable in the long run.
Jeff, she was talking about debt burden. Of course, the U.S. administration has talked about how the Belt and Road Initiative is basically a debt trap. Do you agree with their assessment?
Well, Jin Li Chun, on behalf of the AIIB, has set 3 goals for his projects. He said that they must be financially sustainable, they must be environmentally friendly, and they must be welcomed by the people. And those are the areas where the One Belt, One Road initiative runs into problems frequently, in addition to the debt problem. And there are many countries that have had debt problems that have caused all kinds of problems. And here, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Myanmar, Malaysia, Pakistan, others. So there are numerous countries that are experiencing that problem, despite some of the good work that is also being done.
Einar, I wanted to get your thoughts on this because the U.S. that's kind of one of the statements you hear a lot from the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. It's a debt trap, don't go with it. What are your thoughts there in Beijing?
Okay, so over the last 10 years, you had a deficit of $7 trillion in infrastructure investment. So the idea is that how are these roads, bridges, economic development supposed to happen? Is it just magic? I mean, this is absolutely silly. The U.S. is complaining that China is doing something they're not prepared to do. There are valid issues about how you can finance this, but the AIIB also, as you know, the first issue is, how do you make it sustainable? You cannot make it sustainable by just simply giving money away. So there is an eye towards, will this project actually pencil out? Will there be something at the end of it? And that is necessary if they're to go forward. Otherwise, the funding dries up and everyone cries tears and said nothing happened. Well, why? It wasn't sustainable.
And Liang, that was one of the things early on when the AIIB was launched, is this whole concept of risk. How does the bank go about mitigating that risk?
First of all, I think they have very robust research projects and also farm out some of the important research work to other financial institutions and think tanks to make sure that they have good bankable projects. And for second is, I think infrastructure projects. If you look at any standalone infrastructure project, it's probably not going to be as profitable as you would like. But all these projects together would create a linkages effect and also long-term effects. So I think in terms of financial sustainability, investing in infrastructure, it's actually a much more sustainable way of lending. And finally, I also wanted to say that this sort of so-called debt trap diplomacy has been debunked by many credible research institutes. Right, what they found is in some of these highly indebted countries, China is not the biggest creditor in the first place. And some of the evidence that people often cited, such as the Sri Lanka port. The project would have been profitable, with all the transshipments of fuels, but because of political impediments, this project didn't pan out. But this has nothing to do with China intentionally going in to give bad loans in order to seize the strategic assets. And take Venezuela as example, one of the largest recipients of China's $67 billion of loan. It's not in China's interest whatsoever to put a country like Venezuela or any other African countries in the debt trap in order to keep them in captive of Beijing's wishes and demands, in John Bolton's words. So I think it's really a myth, but it is true that we need to be careful with the sustainable lending practices. So not to increase the burden of debt in African countries. And by the way, the debt issue is not just the developing country issues, but developed countries issues as well. In the U.S., we're talking about also trillions of dollars debt. In the global South, there's $11 trillion of debt, and 3.9 trillion is going to come due by the end of this year. So it is a very significant issue. But again, we don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater. Just because we have a debt problem, it doesn't mean that we should not continue to finance infrastructure, poverty relief, education, etc.
Einar, the AIIB just approved a loan of about $250 million US dollars for Pakistan to help in their COVID-19 response to the pandemic. The bank's president sees the COVID-19 crisis as actually a chance for the bank to prove its place in the world. Is it sort of a litmus test? And what does the bank need to do to carve out that space, do you think?
Well, this is a slightly new direction. I mean, there was $10 billion set aside for this kind of COVID relief. So they're acting more like a relief bank, more IMF and World Bank in this particular regard. But it's necessary, and times require that you do different things. So I think China is doing what is responsible. The question is, what are other groups doing? I mean, if you look at the World Bank, you cited their massive bureaucracy. They're only putting $12 billion into the pie. And the same with the IMF. It's a different way of doing it. So the question is, who is stepping up to make sure that we can get through this crisis at this point? It has to be sustainable in the long run, but in the short run, you cannot ignore voices that are in desperation.
And Jeff, I mentioned this loan to Pakistan. It was co-financed with the World Bank. So I want to ask you about the relationship the AIIB has with the IMF and the World Bank. Is it competition? Is it cooperation? How do you see it?
I think it's probably both. The function is duplicative. The ADB and the IMF were already doing the functions that AIIB is now doing. So there is, to a certain extent, a competition. But I'm very glad to see that there is cooperation as well. I've seen in my own work overseas as an American diplomat that if donors do not cooperate, then you cause inefficiency and maybe even double funding for the same projects. And as for funding COVID, I think that this is something very, very good, very positive, that the bank is taking on this responsibility to shift its priorities a little bit and to address the COVID problem, because also China has a special responsibility with respect to COVID as well.
Emira, I want to ask you about the digital infrastructure, because I think you brought that up earlier. I was at a conference in Beijing back in December. Everybody was talking about 5G, but one of the people on the panel was like, what about some of these countries that just don't have it? How far behind are they going to be? This is a key piece of infrastructure. How important is that for the African continent?
Well, I think you've got to recognize Africa has about 1.5 billion people, and a lot of it is young people who are thirsty for advancement, for innovation, for kind of leapfrogging, right? So what you see are advances, for example, in mobile money that start off in Africa and then go off to the rest of the world. The continent is ripe for those kinds of opportunities. And I think what you have is a need for the investment, quite frankly, right? For investment in young people, for jobs that are going to help the continent to, from its base of expertise, a continent, for example, that has gone through the Ebola crisis, understands well how to build infrastructure around communications as well as around health systems, to kind of build from within, using that vast wealth of young minds to help create a future that looks far different than the past. So I think what we have is an opportunity. And so when we talk about the importance of going beyond loans, I want to go back to that, because yes, if you think about particularly Africa, it's 20% of Africa's indebtedness that's to China. I think we have to underscore that, because I think the concern is that number is going to grow in the future. And so I think we've got to look at at ways in this in this COVID era that we are not adding to the debt burden. Look at new innovations in financing. To what extent, for example, can China, use its leverage and influence to advance issues around special drawing rights for the IMF that will release more funds into the global economy? There are many different ways in which resources can be put towards macroeconomic needs at this critical moment in history. So how do we look at not only a loan facility, but how do we look at a vast range of investment opportunities that will help to create a future that is indeed green, that is indeed innovative, that bridges the digital divide, and make sure that we have the opportunity for everyone to be able to access from health information to education using all the tools that are in our toolbox.
Liang, it is still a young organization. It's got 100 countries that are members right now. What's been the footprint so far, and what are your expectations moving forward?
Yes, it's a young institution, but as I said, I think some of its founding principles, they're really sound, and they seem to have really good prospect going forward. It has now, in the first 2 years, by the way, it has lended $4.4 billion, and the loan portfolio increased by 30% every year. So it is in a healthy growth mode. But I reckon with Emira's point, where that could be a concern for some of the developing nations. So I think what really matters is the quality of the growth, not the quantity, not just the speed of growth, but really bankable, profitable, sustainable projects. I think that is a priority. And by the way, I think China has been doing its own part to help to give debt relief to African countries. In the past 20 years, China has loaned about $152 billion to African countries and had a debt relief of about $3.4 billion. So, China is aware of this, and in the new sort of emphasis of Belt Road Initiative, it's also been emphasized that we need to focus more on the quality, not the quantity of lending. But China cannot do this alone. So I think other countries in the world, especially some of the developed nations, should also play a very important role to help Africa and other developing countries.
Einar, what do you think the AIIB has learned from these institutions that have been around for a long, long time, and what are some of the things that they've been able to do to avoid some of the pitfalls?
Well, quite frankly, most of the staff is drawn from these various institutions, AIIB, World Bank, IMF. I've met many of them. 54% of the loans that are being pushed out are actually jointly done with one or more of those banks. So they're reaching into their toolbox. They know what needs to be done. They're more efficient. We already understand that. But in terms of the way they think about it, I think sometimes they think too conventionally. They have to think a little bit outside the box. And this is what I think COVID has really impressed upon them, and also why Xi Jinping went to the bank to celebrate its five-year celebration, is to say to them that there is an important role beyond just being bankers, that the world is in crisis, it has many needs. Yeah. AIIB isn't going to answer them all, but it's a new approach. That's why it was created. It is not duplicitous in the sense that it's not it's answering a need that only partially. As I said, $7 trillion has gone unfinanced in terms of what is needed.
Yeah. Einar, thanks so much. I want to thank all our panelists. It's been a great discussion. Appreciate it. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter, Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us.